Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Arline Sachs, and this is Sallyann Sachs. And today we're going to talk about Yizkor books and shtetls, which both really deal with towns in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, well, it could be Central Europe.
Yeah, okay.
What it really deals with, if I could say so, I think we're dealing with the destroyed Jewish community, the Jewish communities of Europe that were destroyed during the Holocaust.
Yes. First of all, Yizkor books, they're also known as memorial books.
Right.
So that's what we're dealing with. And the word Yizkor means may God remember in Hebrew. And
right.
that's what we're dealing with. And usually these books tell the story of a specific town, and it's written by the former residents. It's not any fancy type of...
It's the classic Yizkor book was a memorial book, a remembrance book.
And I gather they generally had 4 parts. They talked about the history of the town itself for 100 years, and then the individual remembrances of what the people remembered as they were growing up.
Right.
And then families with no known survivors. It's a list that they remember these people lived in the town.
Right.
And then a necrology of all the victims. So that's what's really important to us as genealogists.
Right.
Besides remembering our town and our own family.
Right, but the lists of names are invaluable because, if I may put in a little plug for my new project, which is called a project to reconstitute the destroyed communities of Europe. The Holocaust, so many people died, and there's no traces. We have half of their names right now, apparently at Yad Vashem, about 3 million, but we know that about 6 million died. And so, as we attempt to increase that list from the 3 million to the 6 million, Yizkor books for our own individual genealogy are great, but they also will help us build that database. And in a sort of way, I mean, we're talking about a whole culture that was 1,000 years of a culture that was obliterated.
Now, let me ask something. Does Yad Vashem have all of the names of the people in the Yizkor books?
Do they have them already in their database?
Yeah.
No, not yet.
So that's what you're going to do is take
it won't just be from Yizkor books.
Obviously, but
no. But what we are doing is trying to recreate the Jewish population on the eve of the Holocaust, and for all the 3 million and for more, to create a family tree, because they were part of a chain of history. We want to recreate that chain of history.
So, so these Yizkor books are found really all over the world.
Well, most of them are in Israel, actually, because Israel and the United States, but remember, after the war, initially, those who survived, the remnant that survived, went to Israel. And I think it's a human need. They were trying to come to grips with what happened, and they would gather on the holiday, on the anniversary of the destruction of the community. You know, they have plaques in Jerusalem, in the hall, for that. And then they felt a need to put down what they remembered and to remember the deceased. I mean, on Yad Vashem, on Yom Kippur, at our memorial service, what do? We read the whole list of everybody that died that year. So
Yad Vashem has about 1,260 books
that they classify as Yizkor.
Now that was very. When I got that email from them, I thought that was very interesting. That there's different classifications of what they consider a Yizkor book and what other organizations consider a Yizkor book.
I asked them that years ago. What is a Yizkor book? And they fumfed and said, well, if it was written by what's called a Landsmannschaft, a committee of people from that community, with the intent of memorializing that community, then they call it a Yizkor book.
But if it was written only by one person,
they might or might not. And don't forget, there were also, since the war, they're now, in Germany especially, all over Germany, there are committees of essentially non-Jews writing memorial books to the Jewish community of that particular town.
Yeah.
So that's another genre. And I think Yad Vashem is calling them memorial Yizkor books. I think
but they wouldn't have the memory of what the Jewish memory behind it.
But
at least it memorializes those that lived there.
And the history. Okay. And so most of the books were written in Israel, which means they're in Yiddish or in Hebrew. Sometimes they have a little bit of English in the front.
That's the main problem for most of us here.
Oh, yes. And I'd be happy to show you a classic Yizkor book.
Let's look at that.
This one is falling apart.
It's a classic one.
It's a classic
of
book.
which we're going to be able to read nothing, right? Oh, it does have an English.
It has a few English pages, but its necrology, its list of the deceased, goes on for pages and pages in Hebrew.
In Hebrew.
And it required me to struggle. Fortunately, it's printed Hebrew, which I can read, and I found all my list. But this is also an example of, it's the town of Braslav, which today is in northeastern Belarus. In the 19th century, it was part of Kovno Gubernia in Lithuania. In the interwar period, it was part of Lithuania. Anyhow.
And that's where your family?
Ultimately, I found out that's where my Amders were from, but I didn't know that for a long time. And the Yizkor book, of course, proved it for me, because when I finally found this town, I wrote to Yad Vashem. I asked if they had any record of a Landsmannschaft, a committee for this town. I wrote to them, and they said, oh, yes, and one of the Amders survived, and she's still living there. Do you want to write to her? And I did, and I learned quite.
I think we need to explain a little bit more about the Landsmannschaft, and they were in general organizations by people from the same...
Of people from the same town or region, because this book for Braslav also includes the villages in the surrounding area, as many of them do.
But Landsmannschaft started earlier, even earlier in this country, as the immigrants came, and those were the people they knew and they tended to associate with, and, and they helped each other and had loans and a lot of other things.
You know, you go back even further. Jewish life in Europe was to a very large extent, for many, many centuries, was self-governing. They only paid taxes to the ruler, but for the rest of it, under the Magdeburg laws, they took care of themselves. And even after that changed in the 19th century, there were all these committees that were part of the Jewish communal structure. And so you had the Free Loan Society, and you had the Burial Society, and you had the committee that visited the sick, and all that kind of stuff. So when these immigrants came to the United States, they recreated these committees. You know, the Chevra Kadisha that buries the dead or prepares the dead for burial, and all these other committees. And so it was natural that a Landsmannschaft, an organization of people from that group, and also with chain migration, you know, people, the first person from a town sent for others from the town, and they all settled in the same place. Or very many did.
Let's take a look at some of the other, okay, so that one is mostly Hebrew with a small translation in English.
Right, and has a large list of the deceased, and was written by the survivors who gather every year in Israel on the anniversary of the destruction of the community. Here's another that's a classic Yizkor book with a difference. Kamenets-Podolsk in Ukraine, a large Jewish community. But you can see the titles in English. And the title's in English because one of our local Genealogy Society members, Bonnie Schuyler-Sohn, translated the whole book, which was originally in Yiddish, and published it. And so this is a rare Yizkor book in that we can read it all. We can read the list of the dead easily. Yeah. And we have, and I should say, almost all of the books start with when the town was first created or the history settled. But you know, they're very spotty because these are not professional historians who are writing. These are survivors.
So they may be off a little bit on some of the dates.
Or the details.
Yeah, I also did a list. As I said, Yad Vashem had 1,260. I sort of did a search, and there's quite a few of libraries that do have them in the United States.
The largest is the Library of Congress. The largest collection is in the Hebraic section of the Library of Congress.
And Brandeis and Cornell have over 400 each. Hebrew Theological College has 350. Florida Atlantic University has 450. The Price Library of Judaica in Florida has 450. Los Angeles Hebrew Union College has 450.
The New York Public has a huge collection.
Yes, did I say 650 of those? But that's still only half.
But Library of Congress has over 1,000.
Oh, do they have? I couldn't get a number on. Yes. So that would be certainly for local people, if they're looking for it, would be a good place.
Oh yes. Now the books, I didn't bring my rarest book this morning. It's quite huge, and it's a county. It's Marmaros County in Hungary, and I had a copy of this book, and my car was stolen, and the book was in the trunk of the car, And that was all I cared about was this rare book. Finally, I got another one. But, you know, they were printed in a limited edition, and they're very hard to find.
Yes.
Sometimes somebody of the original committee dies, and their children don't care very much, and they'll sell them, and you'll find them in used bookstores in Israel. So there's a website. I'm blocking it. You can write to the Israel Genealogical Society. They'll give it to you. There is somebody in Israel who makes a point of collecting them and from these used bookstores, but they can be very pricey at that point. Yeah. And usually you won't get interlibrary loan on these. The New York Public will not interlibrary loan these. Maybe some of the others would.
I one time wanted to borrow a book, and they wouldn't send me the book, but they asked me what pages I wanted or what part I was interested in, and they Xeroxed that.
From the New York Public?
I don't remember where it was from. I just went to the Fairfax County Library to request. I would think I was at Nova.
I'm not certain. I don't know if New York Public as a whole library doesn't interlibrary loan or just the Jewish section doesn't interlibrary loan.
But I can understand it because the book is so rare that if it gets lost, it's...
What I did once do, Harvard University had a rare 19th century book that I wanted, and as an alum, I should be allowed to borrow it. Well, they didn't want to interlibrary loan their rare book. I was persistent. I got the Library of Congress to agree to request it on interlibrary loan for me.
You had to know somebody there to do that.
No, I just went to the Hebraic section and said, would you do it? And they sent me to Rare Books or something. And so if I would agree to read the book in the Rare Books, they would do it. On the other hand, then I found out that for a few dollars, I could get a microfilm copy of the whole book.
That was easier. That's really all you wanted, was to know what's in it.
If you can not get a copy of the book, you should always check and see if that library will make a microfilm copy for you. And they're very cheap, usually.
Yeah, so, okay, what is this?
This is a very interesting book to me. This book is the Jews of Stropka, a town in Slovakia, I think. And it was written by Melody Amsel, who grew up right here in the Washington area. Her father, Milt Amsel, is a member of our society. I believe we had Melody on this show once.
I don't remember.
Melody is not a survivor. She wasn't born in Europe. But as she began to trace her grandfather's town of Stropkov, she did what happened to her happens to so many of us. We become more and more interested beyond our individual family. And Melody now lives in Israel, and she felt this great need to memorialize this town. There was no memorial book. There had been no survivor committee because there hadn't been enough survivors. And so she really did a great deal of work. She's a professional flautist. Is that how you pronounce it? She plays the flute professionally. She's not a historian, but she worked extraordinarily hard and did a really fine book, and it's in English.
And Albertina published it, I guess. See.
Yes, we did. And we sold quite a few of them, as a matter of fact. So and here's another one. It was mailed to me from Israel, though most of it is in English. There's a small section
I had one
in the back. It was about a town I can't pronounce quite, Skoczkov. It's in Silesia in Poland. And this was, again, a committee of survivors, or people who had come out before the Holocaust, and they wrote various articles about the town. Different people wrote articles, and they also do have a list of people who died, but it was a very small list. This would be an example of a place where we would hope that if we could do a reconstruction of the synagogue, we could get more names of the town. But apparently the synagogue survived, and they even made a postcard, and they wrote an article about the cemetery. The cemetery survived.
Hold that up for a few minutes.
Okay, the cemetery survived, and so they have a list in here. It's unusual of all the tombstones and their inscriptions. And that's rare.
That's certainly very useful if you know what town is from. Let's look at it. Let's say somebody knew or thought they knew their ancestor came from a town, Mosiska. I really hesitate to Mosiska.
Mosiska.
And
you know that the spelling would have been phonetic because some old person said we came from Mosiska, and you said to yourself,
I don't know where that is. We can't find it on any map. And they knew also it was in the Ruthenian area of Hungary, and I'm not quite sure offhand.
Subcarpathian Ruthenia. It's the
northern part?
It's the far eastern. Today it's mostly in western Ukraine. It was the point at which Hungary and Czechoslovakia and Ukraine all came together. The mountain area.
And I think there were a lot of Jews in that area.
Very large. It was the largest Jewish population in Hungary.
Okay, so they know where they came from. They're speaking that kind of Yiddish. Why can't I find that town listed? So if they looked it up in your book, where Once We Walked, I guess you want to hold that one up.
This, I have to confess, I took the earlier edition. We now have a revised edition.
Okay, well, also on the screen, this is the book, and if you look it up under the Soundex, it comes up with that list of names there, which is, I'm not going to attempt to begin to say them, but that's all the Soundex. And we should say the Soundex is similar to using a Soundex in the library, the archives,
National Archives.
But it's
well, can I just say a word about the book? Because not everybody's going to know what we're talking about. Gary Mokotov and I published this book in the early 1990s in response to a need that genealogists had. The need was our relatives were telling us about places that we couldn't find on maps. It lists 23,000 Jewish communities that were destroyed in the Holocaust, and because of the problem of spelling, we've arranged at the back of the book something called the Deitch Mokotov Soundex, which was created by Randy Deitch and Gary Mokotov to deal with the problem that the Soundex used by the National Archives in downtown Washington is dreadful for names from Central and Eastern Europe because, for example, the W in snow at the archives is not coded. Well, a W in all these towns is a V sound.
So you need the sound.
You need the sound. So the Deitch Mokotov has become the standard Soundex method for names from Central and Eastern Europe.
So anyway, it came up with this whole list of names. But then, since you knew that, or the person knew that it was from Ruthenian, you can take out those names that are not from that area.
Right.
And you come up with 4 names that were left. And you see the 4 listed there on the screen. And the second and third name, which are in italic there, turned out to be alternate spellings for the last name.
We listed alternate spellings for towns.
And because you need to, because that's just what that person might know.
And of course, the names are listed by latitude and longitude and tell what country they're in today. So that's how we knew Subcarpathian Ruthenia is now Ukraine. Okay.
Okay. So then you're left with only the 2 names: the top name on that list and the bottom one, Tiska, and
the same thing. And of course, this first one has 15 references. All the towns we listed where we could find
How many references?
Well, we found references for the town in different sources. So this looks very much like this one. The only difference is there's a T in the real spelling. And so you're pretty sure that you're left with that's the correct town.
Versus one reference to the other.
Which is, you're going to find out it's an alternate spelling for this.
Oh, is that it?
Probably.
I don't know. But anyway, your book said there were 15 references with 2,300 Jews. So that tells the person then that that's the town instead of the original spelling
Let's see if that one has a Yizkor book.
Oh, that also tells you whether they have a...
Yes, at the time of publication, yes. Yes, here it's in Ukraine. And no, it does not have a Yizkor book, unfortunately. But it has many, many other references, such as the American Gathering of Holocaust Survivors. There were survivors. There's an article in the Encyclopedia Judaica about it. And there's somebody a living genealogist right now is searching for the members of that town, and they've listed their interest on Jewish Gen.
Might be the person who
wrote it. But also, after the war, the survivors were encouraged by Yad Vashem to come and give testimony.
Yeah,
these testimonies, of course, are not in English. But we see here that there's 3 different testimonies listed for them. And also, they have a plaque at this Chamber of the Holocaust, which I mentioned, not by name, in here, meaning that survivors from this town put up a plaque, and on the anniversary of the destruction of that community, they gather at that place in Jerusalem, in the Old City, for a memorial service. Well, if you should happen to be in Jerusalem at that time, or if you arrange to be, you go to that memorial service, because that's where you're going to find the people who maybe knew your relatives.
So that's what you'd have to do if you don't have the Yizkor book. Maybe as a result of that, the person I was looking for would say, let's get together and see what we can find out.
Or maybe it'll be a Melody Amsel who'll write her own.
Who will write her own. So we've got 6 minutes. So
well, let me tell you about my example. My Amder grandfather died when my father was 8 years old. So I start my genealogy, and I really don't know much. But I did, all the things we're supposed to do, and I discovered that he died, just before he died, he took out an application for citizenship. And as you know, the application requires you to tell where you were born. And I see on this application, B-R-E-S-S-L-A-W. Breslov. Well, that's a famous Jewish town, but now today, it's in Western Poland. Today it's called Wrocław. And I start researching. I don't find any Amders. Finally, after being stupid for maybe a year, I said to my father one day, was your father really a Litvak? I was told him. Of course, he says indignantly. I said, well, did he speak Litvak Yiddish? That's one of the ways you conclude. The Jews of Western Polish Yiddish had a different sound. Yes, he said. Okay, I guess it's not that Wrocław. And I had a map of Eastern Europe, a National Geographic map, on my wall opposite my desk, and I'm looking up at it one day with nothing in mind, and all of a sudden my eyes alighted on this teeny dot, and it says B-R-A-S-L-A-V. This town.
So that's how you...
And then I did all the things like I wrote to Yad Vashem and said, do you have a Landsmannschaft address for this town? Well, they said yes, because we also have a Yizkor book. And I got the Landsmannschaft address, and I wrote to them, and then all these good things, and then I found, of course, all these people.
So it sometimes takes a little while to... Now, that was, of course, long before you had this Where Once We Walked, and if you had the Where Once We Walked...
I'd have Soundex, Breslov. I would have had two communities come up, Wrocław now, and this little one that's in northeastern Belarus today.
And you would then know by area that it was in the Litvak area, Lithuanian area.
Right, and of course, and then acquiring the Yizkor book, well, at that point they hadn't finished it, because the maps on the front, in the front, and you can't see them on the screen, and in the back, you take my word for it, were donated by me from photocopies I made at the Library of Congress, because they also did the surrounding area. They didn't just, so...
So you were even involved, so you knew that they were working on it. And
right, they were getting close to it. You can see towns that it's off the map that my grandfather, that I knew he lived in after he married, was just off the map here.
Well, they tended to, you were born in one area and then we
they
lived
moved
in
around.
It's amazing how much they moved around, considering how primitive, compared to our thinking today of what
That's
they
one
had.
That's one of the really important things to do. What we've learned since the archives have opened is that they didn't root themselves in one little place. They spread out over a region. Usually there were little market towns, 12 to 20 miles apart. That was the distance a man could walk in one day. And brothers and brothers-in-law would spread out because, you had to have a business. And in this area, my Amders were innkeepers, and all the Jews in that area were initially. They were the Polish noble who owned the town invited them to come in and establish inns and organize the liquor industry. So that's where you sold it. And so you had these roadside taverns that were also inns all around the region. And then only later, this is so cute, they moved off the farm into the town of Breslov. They moved away from these inns into the town, but they had to be close enough so that they could gather for a minyan and all do all these other religious obligations.
I know my great-great-grandfather wrote one time, we met my daughter because that was within the walking distance. The total distance was more than they could walk on a Saturday, but if they decided to meet in the middle, that was...
right, okay, that was the deal. In a day, the significance was on the Shabbat.
Yeah, how far they could walk on
Shabbat. Exactly. And so it turns out, and you see this with the Yizkor books, they aren't content. At least the traditional earliest ones weren't content just to do The little town itself, they spread out around the district.
Well, that's good, because I mean they all considered themselves part of that community or whatever, or probably came to services there.
Oh, or buried there. The cemetery was there.
Well, yes, the cemetery. They were only allowed. I don't know how it was in Eastern Europe, but in Western Europe, in Germany, sometimes the cemeteries were not necessarily near the town, but they were within what we would call a county. And it was really much further to go to that cemetery over there than this one here. I found my grandmother over here, but she died here. In the early years,
of course, there was the fear of the epidemics. So cholera and all that, you buried people out of town, of course.
Yeah, well, the only reasons we have cemeteries in town today is because that used to be out of town at one time. I don't think they...
Do you know that the oldest cemetery in Manhattan is a Jewish cemetery in Chinatown?
No,
and they won't dig it up because, of course, that's the other thing. Jewish law says you preserve cemeteries. It's very valuable land. It's a Sephardic cemetery, and they aren't digging it up.
I'm surprised they haven't built over it.
No, they won't allow it. The Spanish and Portuguese synagogue will not allow that to be touched.
Oh, good for them.
It must be $1 million an inch.
Well, this I hope people have learned a little bit about the shtetls and about how to find a shtetl and the Yizkor books, the memorial books, to those that were lost during the Holocaust.
And as a very valuable source of information, because so much of our genealogy work is really Holocaust work.
Yes, a lot of it is.
Yeah, and it's that chain of history that got smashed when you have to pick up the pieces to continue back.
Okay, well...